Morning. It's a privilege to be here with you this morning. Laura and I, my wife Laura, is sitting down here, and we've been almost 40 years married. Next month we'll celebrate our 40th anniversary. And since 1987, we've been with OMS, both of us full-time, and then we came back to the U.S. in 2008 after a little over 22 years in Brazil, South America. And Laura started a little bit more in the academic world. She now teaches at Taylor University. She serves with me more as a volunteer when she's not during the academic year, so it's a privilege for me to have her with me here this morning. This is an incredibly rich text that was just read. And there is a lot here. I'll walk us through a few things that I picked out to share about this morning. A few things that have touched me. So I know you're looking at Matthew and seeing the life of Jesus, which is a wonderful thing. And he shares some powerful insights here in these 10 verses. So I'll just mention one thing quickly about the first 5 verses when Jesus is talking about these cities, that the people in the cities that knew a lot about Jesus, they saw Jesus do a lot of miracles, but they didn't follow Jesus. And he says, you will be judged severely because you know a lot, but you don't do much about it. And I think, how much have I been given growing up in a Christian home, knowing the Lord since I was a kid? How much have I been given? And am I being accountable for all that I've received? And we could do that individually. We can do that as a church. We can do that as a nation. Our nation has been given a lot, and we're not very well off right now as a nation. We will be held accountable for what we know. And that struck me, kind of like a continuum. How much I know about Jesus versus what am I doing about what I know? And where do I fit on that continuum? That's a good thing for us to stop and think about. And maybe the Holy Spirit will work with us if we need to come back and think about that. Then verses 25 to 27, we get a glimpse of Jesus' upside-down economy. Now, it's upside down from our fallen human perspective. Because from our perspective, Jesus says a lot of things that just don't make sense from our fallen human perspective. You get hit on one side of the cheek, you're supposed to turn the other side of the cheek? That doesn't make sense to us, does it? If you're a leader, if you are the Son of God, does it make sense for you to get a towel and a basin and wash the disciples' feet? Doesn't make sense in our worldview. That's his worldview. It doesn't make sense if somebody hurts us again and again for us to forgive 70 times 7. That's how God, Jesus, looks at how life should be. We don't look at it like that. So we think of how Jesus perceives the world, and we think it's upside down, when really we're the ones that are upside down. But he gives us a glimpse of that in this passage, because he says these important truths about God's kingdom, they've been hidden from all these smart people, these religious doctors and these pastors and these doctors of religion. They don't understand. They can't grasp it. You have to be childlike. That's Jesus turning the world upside down again. To be Now, there are some things about being a childlike that are not what Jesus is talking about. We have a few months ago, this is a story that we have 2 daughters. Our older daughter was babysitting our younger daughter's 2 kids. They're 2 and 4. And so they're taking a bath, Leo and Cece. Leo's 2, Cecilia is 4. And Leo has a toy that Cecilia wants. And Cecilia tells our daughter, Aunt, he has a toy. I want to play with that. And so she asked 2-year-old Leo, Leo, can your sister play with that? He said, yes. And of course, that was the right answer, wasn't it? And then he looks to his aunt with a gleam in his eyes and says, I'm never going to be done. That's childlike, isn't it? That's selfish. We're selfish too, we just hide it better than kids do. That's not the childlike Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about the childlike of trust and faith and be childlike. Like that 2-year-old is willing to jump off of a 6-foot ledge into the arms of a dad that he trusts. That's the kind of childlike that Jesus is talking about here. So here again, something that I got out of this passage when I was reading it, a continuum again. How much do I trust Jesus with my life, with my future, with my relationships, with my money? over here, and over here, a 0 and a 10. Where do you place yourself on how much do you trust Jesus? Are you childlike in that trust? The last 3 verses of this passage are verses that if you've been in the church for a while, you've heard them many times. You know, Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest." You've heard that before if you've been in church for a few years or more. What does Jesus mean about that? Come to me and I'll give you rest. Does that mean come to me and I'll give you a permanent weekend where you can rest? That's not what he means. Does it mean to come to me and you won't have problems in life? That can't be what it means, because you just look at the lives of the 12 apostles, and either church tradition or historical documents tell us that all of them but one died a martyr. So that wasn't an easy life. It certainly didn't mean come to me and I'll give you prosperity gospel. That's not what Jesus is talking about at all. Let me just give you, Laura and I were pastors in Brazil for over 20 years, and we know how a church, we know the life of a church. We know there are tragedies in a church. We know there are terminal illnesses, and we know we pray, and sometimes God heals, and we've seen that, and sometimes God doesn't, and we've seen that, and that's where the childlike faith comes in. We've seen tragedies. In our church in Brazil, getting a frantic call from a mother who had just lost her 2-year-old only child in a drowning accident in a friend's pool. Every church has stories like that because it's life, and it rains on the just and the unjust. I visited a couple of countries in Southeast Asia last fall. This is one of them. I'd be glad to tell you the countries later if you're interested. But the man in the middle there, sitting in the back, he told me just a brief part of his testimony. And he said he grew up in a Muslim village, town, and when he was 16, 2 missionaries came to that town. And he heard about Isa. Isa is Jesus in Arabic. He heard about Isa, and something stirred in his heart, and he wanted to follow Isa. And he told the missionaries he wanted to be a follower of Jesus. The word got to his grandfather, who was the leader of that village, of that small town. And his grandfather called him and said, "You denounce this Isa right now, or else tomorrow you die." He fled with the 2 missionaries that night and didn't go back to his hometown or family for over 20 years. He is a church planter. A church planter in his country means small house churches where 8 to 15 people might meet in a given house. And he not only plants those churches, he supervises them and trains them and teaches them. That's not an easy life. Being a Christian in a Muslim context, that's hard. This is a group of, they call them secret Muslim believers. This is in a different country in that part of the world. These are people that they not only have small house churches, but they oversee and plant other ones. All of them are responsible for between 7 and 15 other small house churches in their area. One of these ladies had this testimony to share. Well, she shared this testimony with me later, a few months later in January. I found out how her story continued. Her husband was working in Iran and came back home because that job was done. And he was upset because he found out his wife was a secret Muslim believer. Within 2 or 3 weeks, he saw the difference. He decided to commit his life to Isa and become a Jesus follower. In January, he went missing, and they found his body. He had been tortured and killed because he converted to Christianity. Actually, the words of his widowed wife, she said, "I am more confident and bold now to tell people about Jesus than I was even before." It didn't dampen her, it strengthened her resolve to tell people about Jesus. This green roof is a mosque. This is a group of people called the Rohingya people. These are people that were persecuted and ousted from their country, which was what we used to call Burma. Now we call it Myanmar. And they were ousted from their country because of intense persecution. And they came to live in this other country within a fenced-in, encamped place. This is 1 square mile of encampment where 1.2 million people live. This is the equivalent of 5 Greenwood Park malls. That's about 1 square mile. And you put the population of Fort Wayne and Indianapolis in that area. That's how many people live crammed into this space. Unhealthy, difficult, and this is one of 600 mosques in this 1 square mile. I was able to visit this place the day after this imam decided to follow Isa, decided to follow Jesus. And this is myself and our guide, Philip, that are presenting him with a Bible in his native language. He highly respects the written word. And what a privilege for me to just show up as an outsider and be a part of giving this imam, which is a pastor in their context, a Bible as he tries to follow Jesus. And what a difficult life he has to live in this kind of situation, to tell people about Isa, Jesus. This next picture is these girls were all rescued from the brothel. Their moms worked there. And these girls have all been legally given over to this Christian ministry that we partner with in that country. The moms are eager to sign papers to allow their daughters to be taken in by this Christian ministry, or else they will receive a lot of pressure from the people they work for in the brothel, to bring their young daughters back into the brothel. So when these women go to work, they put their children outside the door. And these are all girls that have been rescued by this Christian ministry. And it takes them a long time to start trusting the women caretakers. So these are the kinds of things that this does not mean come to me and I'll make your troubles go away. But this is the world we live in. This is the world that we as a church, Mount Auburn, the church we pastored in Brazil, Comunidade Shalom, and all the other congregations of the world, we're all part of the kingdom of God as we serve together in a world like this. So what did Jesus mean when he said, "Come to me, all of you that carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest"? He wasn't meaning, come to me and you won't have trouble. So what did he mean? If you were in that crowd that day when Jesus said that, you wouldn't have any doubt. You would know what he meant. Oh, wow, that's really good news. Because you would think like this: I follow Isa, but it's so hard. There's so many things I have to do to be acceptable to God. There's so many rules I have to follow. You know that commandment, keep the Sabbath holy? Don't work on the Sabbath, that commandment? The Pharisees, the religious leaders of the people, had determined over 600 ways, over 600 rules that you have to follow to make sure you don't break the Sabbath. And that's over 600 rules just for one commandment. And that was the burden that people felt. Wow, to be accepted by Yahweh, I have to do all those things? How can I keep track of all that? That's a heavy burden. So that's what you would have understood if you heard Jesus say those words. Because Jesus is saying, I will carry the heavy burden. You come to me like a child in faith and trust. I carry the burden. My yoke is easy. You just have to have faith in me. You have to trust me like a child. You don't have to do all that. It's grace. You can't work your way to heaven. You can't do things to be acceptable, but my righteousness can cover you. That's why it's easy. That's why my yoke is easy and my burden is light, because I will do it with you and for you. That's what you would have understood when you were there. I'll give you a glimpse of a picture that helps us figure that out. See that poor donkey? That's the heavy load. That's the heavy burden. There's no way that donkey can do its job because his load is too heavy. And that's the easy load. That's what it should look like. That yoke there that's on the donkey's shoulders. Now, one thing, a lot of times a yoke will be for two animals. And Jesus says, take my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Picture yourself, and Jesus is your partner beside you. He does the heavy lifting. His yoke, he takes care of it, and we walk beside him. That makes our yoke easy. Look at verse 28 and look at the first three words that Jesus says. If you have a red letter Bible, it's those first three words in red. And Jesus says, "Come to me." That's what missions is all about. You know, I work in a mission agency called OMS. That's what missions is about. It's about telling the news around the world to people. Jesus' message is, "Come to me." That's what missions is all about. So what's your role in that, and what's my role in that? We all do this together. Mission agencies or people that are professional clergy, like Pastor Jeff, like me, it's not up to us. We're not the professionals that do it. It's up to us as a church. We, his church, worldwide, we need to obey this commission that he's given us. We call it the Great Commission. Go everywhere and tell people about Jesus. Go everywhere and say, this is Jesus' message. He says, "Come to me." And that's what missions is all about. I have a good friend. His name is Bobby. He served over 30 years in the U.S. Army. He was a chaplain. He was a chaplain that did everything with his troops. He was deployed many times. He would jump out of airplanes with his troops. He said, "Jeff, it takes an average of 10 support people for one frontline soldier." Because, you know, the Army has everything. They have cooks, they have lawyers, they have policemen, they have people that do cybersecurity. I mean, you name it, the Army has a place for all sorts of support staff. That's kind of how it is in missions. To have one missionary in Thailand needs a lot of support. And so all roles within the church to support the work that goes on are valid. And it made me think about that. I also thought about a difference. In my role in my work, I work for a mission agency here in the homeland, and we support missionaries, residential missionaries in 20-some countries, and itinerant missionaries in many, many others. We're connected in probably 75 countries right now. So in my day job, I am support for those missionaries out there in various parts of the world. But I'm also frontline, because when I go home and I drive into my cul-de-sac, our three neighbors, to our knowledge, a couple of them are somewhat religious, and one, well, I don't think at all. But in that role, I'm frontline. You are too. I doubt if anybody here only has Christian neighbors. You have neighbors that might know about Jesus, something, but they don't follow Jesus. And so in that role, you're frontline too, and I'm frontline too. And so it's a little bit different because we carry both of those roles. I'll just share a couple of things about OMS. OMS, one way we share about this message that Jesus says, "Come to me," one way we do that is, this is a picture of Tom. He belongs to your church. He comes to the earlier service. He was with me in Mexico, and that's him baptizing a young lady. This is in Mexico. It's an area we call the Circle of Silence. Silence is because in that whole area, 3 million people, there's not much known about Jesus. It's kind of silent. People don't know who Jesus is or why he exists. And so that's why we're concentrating in one area. It's called the city of La Piedad. And we're concentrating there. We call it the Circle of Silence. Other missions agencies call it that too. And we're facilitating work in the body of Christ with a number of different churches and pastors in that area that are small and struggling. One of them even said to us, "We're so glad you're here because we don't feel alone. We feel we're connected to the church in the world and we get support. Thank you for coming." In this passage, Jesus says, "Let me teach you," or your version might say, "Learn from me." And that's what missions is about too. We're going to different places in the world. How can we help people learn about Jesus? How can you stand before God? How can I stand before God and say, "Teach me what I still need to learn, Lord"? I'm in a country where access is easy, and I might know a lot, but how do I follow better those things that I know? I also really appreciate a couple things that, well, I'll say one more thing here about another country, just to get a clue. In the country of Thailand, we have missionaries in the country of Thailand, and I like a testimony that Laura and I heard in January when we were with this couple, and Scott Morrison is his name, and they've gone with their young family to Thailand to tell people about Jesus. That's why they're there. He'll go out walking in his neighborhood to see who he can tell about Jesus. And here, you know how here when you meet somebody, sometimes instead of saying hi, somebody will say, "How you doing?" That's kind of a way to say hi in our culture. In Thailand, a way to say hi in their culture is, "Where you going?" Our "how you doing" is their "where you going." And so Scott will go out, and somebody will meet him on the road, and he'll say, "Scott, where you going?" And he'll answer literally. He'll say, "Oh, I'm just out blessing people. Would you like a blessing?" Now, they are religious people, far from Christian, but they are religious. And who doesn't want a blessing? Like, yeah, I want a blessing. And Scott will say, "Any specific way that I could bless you?" And they might say about a daughter that's sick, or they lost a job, or some other difficulty. And Scott, "Hey, let me just bless you right now." And Scott will pray, a simple prayer. It's happened more than a few times where a week later or 3 weeks later, that person will meet Scott again and say, "Hey, you know that blessing you gave me? My daughter got better the next day." Or they'll say, "I got a job a week later. Tell me more about that blessing. What was that all about?" And that's a wide open door for him to tell them about Jesus and tell them how they can come to me, how they can come to Jesus. So those are exciting things that are happening, and we just get a glimpse of them in our world. I would like to, before I close here, I'd like to just challenge you to think and pray about something. As a mission agency, we are celebrating our 125th anniversary in 3 years. 3 years from right now, we'll be 125 years old. And I hear that you're going to be celebrating 200 years at that same time. And that's pretty cool. We need more missionaries. We need missionaries because we have places in Thailand, in Colombia, in Hungary, so many countries where we need people. And God is calling people. And I think God will call some people from this church. And my request would be for you to be attentive. Who might God be calling from this church that you can send out in the next 3 years as missionaries? That might be a full-time residential missionary. They go and they live there. It might be an itinerant missionary. Itinerant missionary is a term we use when there are a lot of countries that we can't go to as missionaries. We call them itinerant because countries are closed to people that look like us or from the United States going there. But we can go in for 2 weeks at a time as tourists, and yet we go in there to help a local church or support a pastor, encourage the local church, or to take training. But I would like to ask you to, as you think about missions, as you think about what God is doing in the world, my challenge would be, would you pray with us that God would send out more missionaries through OMS and other organizations too? We're not in competition with any other agency. We're all in this together. Just like your church isn't in competition with any other church. We're all about the kingdom, not any smaller kingdom. But if you could pray with us about this, and I would challenge you to even think about sending people on short-term trips. A lot of missionaries that we have in our agency first went out on a short-term trip because they have to get out of their cultural surroundings, out of their comfort zone, and see a different culture. We have a lot of trips to different places. Mexico is an easy one to go to, and we're sending a lot of people to the Circle of Silence. So as you think about missions, that'd be my challenge to Mount Auburn. How can you be involved? But let's go back to just finish up on a personal level. You are front line with your neighbors. You are front line to pass the message of, "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest." And we are front line in that capacity too, but we are also support staff for the work that God is doing around the world.